Welcome to Coffee with Cornelius. We are talking here with various people of interest. Today, we're here with Leo Knight. We're talking crime and punishment. We will talk about how COVID-19 is affecting crime and violence. We'll talk about corruption in Canadian politics, and we will talk about the recent horrendous mass shooting in Nova Scotia. Mr. Knight is a former RCMP police officer. He served with the Vancouver Police Department, and he is an entrepreneur. He had a security business for a long time, and he is now a fellow with the True North Center and maintains his own crime news website, primetimecrime.com. Mr. Knight, thank you for joining us today. Let's talk about COVID. Let's talk about COVID first of all. COVID-19 lockdowns, as we know, are causing changes for many people, hardships, increasing reliance on illicit drugs, economic hardship, as well as boredom, quite frankly, and cabin fever. Has there been an increase in crime following lockdowns? And can you point to specific examples?
Well, yeah, there has been. With lockdowns of businesses, especially small businesses, there's been a real increase in property crime, people targeting those places that are locked down, they know are not staffed. Vancouver police just recently broke up a ring that was targeting businesses that were shut down. They put over 40 break-in enters to that group of people. They put out a press release, by the way, to tell people some measures they might take to safeguard their properties. Property crime seems to be the problem, whereas people who are taking advantage, if you will, they're opportunistic.
I see. Has there been any increase in organized crime? I've been reading a report that, for example, said that people are using more illicit drugs, but the crime syndicates are finding it difficult to get the drugs and get the ingredients to make the drugs from places like Mexico and China.
Well, certainly the importation or the smuggling, if you will, of illicit drugs has not really changed a lot. What has changed is that the street level dealers are having a little bit more difficulty to getting their products to the end user. It's spanning a lot of things like dial-a-dope operations and stuff like that, so that the people dial up their local dealer and they deliver, as opposed to going and finding them on the corner. But I wouldn't say that it's really hampered organized crime. Organized crime, in my experience, has always been very robust and very flexible, and they'll find a way to do it.
So you've been with the Vancouver Police Department, you've been with the RCMP, you've had your own security firm. What has been your experience with organized crime, and how do they adjust to crises like this one?
It really depends on what you're talking about. There's several levels of it, whether you're talking about traditional organized crime, such as the mafia, outlaw motorcycle gangs, or Asian organized crime. They're all components of it. By fluid, what I mean is they may set up a smuggling route, and if that gets broken up, I mean, within a matter of days, they've got a new route planned. And things like the coronavirus with lockdown and stuff like that, the difficulty they're having is that with so few vehicles on the road, they're probably easier for police to target.
I see. What about domestic violence? Has domestic violence seen an increase following COVID-19?
I'd have to speculate a little bit because I really don't know. What we saw in Nova Scotia last week appears to be the result of domestic violence of some sort. And again, details remain to be seen from the follow-up police investigation into that. Having said that, with people at close quarters for so long, with no ability to release or get away, it seems to me logical that there would be an increase in domestic violence. But having said that, that's just speculation. I don't know that to be true or not.
Fair enough. Now let's turn to those tragic events which unfolded last week in Nova Scotia. It was a tremendous tragedy. One of your own RCMP officers lost her life. It was a mass shooting that involved, as far as we know, at least 23 deaths and 3 injuries, perhaps more. The Nova Scotia RCMP was criticized during this crisis for not using its alert ready system, which basically sends, I believe, texts to various people and alerts via the TV and various other communications media, informing them that there is a situation. So they were criticized for not using its alert ready system, as well as taking too long to respond to the perpetrator. Are such criticisms warranted in your estimation?
Well, no, I mean, I had a video up yesterday on True North talking about exactly that. Nova Scotia is a province with only 1 million people. It's not a big place in terms of population. The Provincial Emergency Center, which puts out those notifications, is not staffed on weekends. This event in Nova Scotia occurred Saturday night at roughly 10:30 p.m. when the first calls came in. There was nobody in the Provincial Operations Center. Their staff came in on Sunday morning, realized that something was going on, called in additional staff to respond to what they believed the RCMP would require, and then contacted the RCMP at 10:15 on Sunday morning to say that they're available now for if they need them. And what happened then is the media people at the emergency center contacted didn't have the authority to green light that because they weren't part of the investigation. They needed to get a green light from the incident commander. They contacted incident command while that message was flowing up the chain. As you can well imagine, the incident commander was extremely busy that morning. And by the time, and in the interim, the media folks were crafting a message to put out on the provincial emergency alert. And during that interim period is when ERT located the suspect and engaged him and terminated him.
You say that there was no staff on the weekend. Is it fair to say that this is a fault of staffing? Who's to blame here? Is this the provincial government? Is this the federal government? Who's ultimately the culprit? I mean, you can't say that tragedies don't happen on the weekend, right?
No, but in Nova Scotia, it's a small place. They don't get a lot of emergency situations. So I guess whoever's responsible for managing the Provincial Emergency Center made the qualitative decision at some point how he's going to allocate his staffing, and he decided that after-hour shifts on weekends would not be staffed. That's not my call. It's certainly not the RCMP call. And whether you can criticize that person or not, I'll leave that up to your judgment.
Is there a problem, do you think, with the RCMP in terms of their PR, in terms of their ability to communicate with the media?
Well, I'm never going to be a defender of the RCMP's media relations strategy or whatnot, but in this particular situation, it was incredibly dynamic and very fluid. In fact, the RCMP didn't even realize that the suspect had got out of the containment area until several hours later, when he started to commit other homicides, and that's when they were able to put two and two together. And again, he traveled almost 150 kilometers, generally heading south towards Halifax, committing crimes along the way. I mean, it was a very I don't know what other word to use, a very fluid situation. And I'm not sure what the RCMP could have put out. Had the emergency center been staffed and they put out a message saying they had an active shooter, really, what does that tell people? There's a problem? Yeah, well, RCMP get firearms calls every day in every jurisdiction in the country. So does the municipal police. They occur all the time. Sometimes it's something as simple as people hearing a car backfiring and they call the police thinking they heard a shot fired. Other times it's more convoluted than that. But in terms of that, until the police knew what they were dealing with, there's very little information they could put out. And they didn't know, and this is instructive to notice, that the girlfriend of the suspect herself was assaulted and tied up, not killed, tied up. She escaped from her knots and whatnot and fled into the woods behind the residence there, and she hid. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that she was found by RCMP, and she was only interviewed by them between 7 and 8 in the morning, and that's when they learned the identity of the suspect and the fact that he may be wearing RCMP uniform garments and be driving a vehicle disguised to look like a marked police car.
So let's talk about this guy, Gabriel Wortman. He's the Nova Scotia shooter. He, I believe, am I right in saying that he had a history of assault? He had a history with the law.
Well, it's not a long history. I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of criminal records that are much more extensive than his. He had one conviction in 2000, or from a 2001 incident of an assault on, I believe, was a 15-year-old male. He pled guilty to that in late part of 2002. was given a conditional sentence and a 90-day probation period. And there's a couple of other conditions on his probation, such as no contact with firearms or explosives. But the thing with the conditional discharge is, as long as you live by the conditions set upon you by the court for the prescribed period of time, that conviction goes away.
I see.
You know, you can't find it if you search court records or anything along those lines. It still shows up in the police database. You know, they're aware of it, but it doesn't. It's not a formal record. It's not something that would prevent you, say, from crossing the border into the United States or anything along those lines that normally a criminal record would.
So let's talk about these firearms that he had. These firearms, my understanding is, were illegally purchased. There's now a move in Canada, including by the Prime Minister, to further restrict firearms sales. Is this a good idea?
It's ridiculous. It's
Hmm.
stupid. And at the risk of calling the Prime Minister stupid, I'll take that risk. Uh, he the firearms were illegal. There's no amount of legislation that you can craft that might have prevented this incident. Nothing. You know, only by further restricting firearms, you're restricting lawful people from getting firearms to go hunting or
Hmm.
whatever the case may be. You're taking away the ability for law-abiding citizens in order to be seen to be doing something. Well, my advice to the Prime Minister is don't do anything. Otherwise, you just look foolish and you're hurting law-abiding people.
Yeah, and this country has a great tradition of hunting and use of firearms for sports and that sort of thing. So I would agree with you. I think also, am I right in saying that Canada's firearms laws are already quite restrictive? It's very difficult to
Oh, they're amongst the
acquire
most
them.
restrictive
Yeah,
in the world, Cornelius. It's
yeah,
I don't know what this government thinks they're going to do or going to achieve. Um, Assault weapons, and I hate that term because anything can be used as an assault
yeah,
weapon, but assault weapons, as they've been described, typically are semi-automatic carbines that have a pistol stock, a hand grip, if you will, and oftentimes a flash suppressor on the muzzle. You know, those types of weapons, for the most part, have been illegal in Canada since the early '90s. You
yeah.
know, what are you going to further restrict? You know, Grandpa's squirrel gun. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Would you say that there is a happy medium between having very restrictive laws like Canada and having sort of loose laws like the United
And
States?
you have to be careful on this
Yeah,
because too many people jump to conclusions. They jump to a narrative that they hope to be true so they can criticize governments in the United States. In all 50 states right now, there is a required background check
hmm,
before you can get a gun. And you know, and they oftentimes you hear the red herring talking about gun shows. Well, you can't go to a gun show without providing identity and getting a
yeah,
background check and walk away with a gun. You just simply can't do it. You
yeah.
know, the you know, whether you want, if you want to have a conversation about whether there should be concealed carry laws or some of the other things that you have in the States that are not available in Canada, that's fair enough. That's probably fair comment. But you know, to you know, use these red herring tropes used by the hand wringers and the political left, I think is just, it's foolish.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I personally know gun owners. They're some of the most benign people you'll ever meet, right? They're not
Well,
dangerous at
if you're
all.
law
Yeah,
abiding in
yeah,
Canada and you
yeah,
want to buy a gun, you've got to take a course in safe
yeah,
handling. You then got to get a PAL. Then you go out and you get your gun, and you've got to abide by the laws and safe transport. And by the time you get it home, then you've got to store it in such a manner that the ammunition is stored in a separate location from the gun. It's all got to be locked down. You know, I mean, if people follow those laws in this country, why would you want to further restrict them? I just don't get that.
So this is a speculation. Why do you think the government, and to be quite frank, this is a politicization of a tragedy, right? Let's just be clear about that.
No
This is a
question. No question.
politicization of a tragedy. Why do you think the government under Justin Trudeau is so keen to restrict firearms for people who want to hunt and who just want to shoot for sport?
Authoritarian control is one
Yeah.
thing. He also wants to be seen to be doing something.
Hmm.
Last year, Toronto had its highest year ever in terms of gun homicides. But those homicides are almost exclusively committed by handguns, people with handguns, and in virtually all cases that I've looked at, illegal handguns, guns
Hmm.
typically smuggled in from the United States by organized crime. How are you going to deal with that? Why don't you go after the gangbangers?
Yeah.
You know, Stephen Harper, for example, had a law in the books for a mandatory minimum if you got convicted of convicting a gun crime. One of the first things Trudeau did when he came to power was to get rid of that law. I mean, how ridiculous is that? You want to be seen to being tough on gun crime. Why in the heck would you allow gun crime criminals to get early release out of prison when they could be contained and not committing any further gun crimes? It's ridiculous.
So I'm going to push back a little bit. I've heard from Canadians, and you've probably heard from Canadians, in a civilized society, the only people who should have guns are the police and the military. How would you respond to that?
So we shouldn't go hunting ever. Target shooting is an Olympic sport.
Hmm.
You know, so is cross country skiing with a rifle, and then target shooting when you're out of breath. They
Yeah.
award medals for it for good performance. You're saying we shouldn't take part in any of that anymore? That farmers should not be able to keep a firearm handy in their homes when there's a coyote attacking their herd? I mean, that it's patently ridiculous.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. Let's turn to a separate issue. Let's look at the Canadian national government. Let's look at federal politics. As part of COVID-19 lockdowns, and I believe this is probably done in conjunction with the Bloc, I'm not sure, but the Canadian government claims to have shut down illegal border crossings, including the infamous one at Roxham Road. Why is it a problem to have migrants who enter illegally to begin with? Just from a law and order perspective, why would it be an issue?
You probably want to know who it is that's coming into your home, don't you? It's no different than the country as a whole. Why wouldn't we want to know who's coming into our country? I think it's a very important issue that people need to come to the country legally. We're very inviting, welcoming country as we should be and as we have been for generations. That doesn't need to change.
Hmm.
Um, but people need to stand in line. We can't be encouraging people to break our laws, and that's exactly what allowing illegal immigration is about. Is we're inviting people to break our laws, and that's again patently ridiculous.
Are illegal border crossings still happening during these lockdowns?
Well, they are, but the government of Justin Trudeau has disguised it. It used to be under the Customs Act that in order to enter Canada, you had to enter at an official point of entry, and that's what Roxham Road developed from, because under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, uh, once on Canadian soil, anybody can claim refugee status. At which point the Immigration Refugee Protection Act kicks in. So people were coming here being educated by the people traffickers and being told what to say. So as soon as the RCMP intercepted them, they'd say they wanted refugee status, and then the immigration folks, or they'd be turned over to IRB, Immigration Refugee Board, and all manner of Canadian programs kicked in, including housing, including food, including welfare, including free healthcare, the whole thing, just by saying they wanted to be a refugee.
I'm sorry,
So
just to be clear, what you're saying is if I'm living down south in the United States, all I need to do is show up at the border, claim refugee status, and then I get everything that Canada has to offer.
Well, formerly, yes, that was exactly true. Then, when Trudeau announced the closure of the border and the closure of the Roxham Road entry point, uh, just 2 weeks ago, he changed the rules and reactivated exception clauses under the Safe Third Country agreement with the United States that allows you to go to an official point of entry and claim refugee status. Previously, you couldn't do that.
Hmm.
Now, because of what the government has done, you can do that, and so the tap has been turned on again.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the whole point of the safe third party or third country agreement is that if you're an actual refugee as defined by the United Nations. Your first country of refuge is where you need to claim that status.
Hmm.
And all these people coming from the United States, how can they possibly claim that is not a safe country versus whatever country they came from? If they're fleeing from Nicaragua, claiming that they're being politically challenged, or they're under a threat from organized crime or the gangs or whatever, fine. But then that status needs to be claimed in the United States. You can't be in a safe haven like the United States, and then because our welfare system is more generous, suddenly decide you're going to come to Canada and then claim status here, and then we
Hmm.
give it to you.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I'm just curious now. This is something that you have your finger on. I think you have the pulse on it. How do you perceive that police and RCMP officers, just personally, how do they view this particular government, the Trudeau government?
Um, Most police officers tend to be conservative.
I
They
see.
tend to be, well, they're law and order folks. I mean,
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
just by nature. And that's not to say they're all conservative in terms of the way they vote.
Hmm.
Police officers, like anybody else, they'll depending on how you perceive elections, whether you vote for what you consider the most capable candidate or you vote by party line or whatever. I mean, police officers, like any other segment of the population, they vote in a number of different ways, but typically their views are more conservative. Yes. What they don't like, being law and order folks, is they don't like any government. But certainly the government of Justin Trudeau has proved that the rule of law in this country uh, need not necessarily be maintained, and that's the problem.
Well, I'm glad you say that they don't, in general, like any government, because my next question is about politics in general. On March 1st, you wrote an article demanding that the RCMP investigate Trudeau. Now, I don't particularly like Trudeau, but I don't particularly like Harper either. I find, for example, that Harper committed some misdeeds under the robocalls and various other advertising revenues that were allocated in a way that perhaps isn't congruent with Canadian values. Why should the RCMP investigate Trudeau specifically? What did Trudeau do?
Well, he's done several things,
Hmm.
but more specifically, the whole debacle last year with Judy Wilson-Raybould,
Hmm.
and that whole thing with SNC-Lavalin, I think really needs an RCMP investigation. When you've got elements within the Prime Minister's office, including the Prime Minister himself, his principal assistant, and the clerk of the Privy Council, um, putting pressure on the Justice Minister to abandon a prosecution against a Quebec company, I think you've got a very significant potential case of obstruct justice. And to me, that really needs to be investigated thoroughly, and then a decision needs to be made by the Crown Prosecution Service whether charges will be brought. That's not to say that I think that Justin Trudeau or Gerald Butts or anybody committed a crime specifically. I'm saying there's a prima facie case on the surface of things to be answered, and that needs to be investigated thoroughly.
Right. Now, we talked about SNC-Lavalin. Previous governments have had corruption scandals. We know about Jean Chrétien, the sponsorship scandal. We know about Stephen Harper, the robocall scandal. Do you believe that there is a lot of political corruption in Canadian politics, whether at the provincial or the federal level, that is not being investigated, that is sort of like an iceberg? It's under the surface of the water.
I was born and raised in Montreal, and in Quebec, politics especially, um, corruption and politics goes together like gravy and poutine.
Sure.
It's it's
Yeah.
massive. It's always been there. Um, it's involved in the police service. It's involved in the sûreté. There's been many scandals over the years. I remember a project in the mid '90s that we're looking into at the start of the gang war, the biker gang wars, um, where the Sûreté's investigation force was reaped in scandal, and it had to be disbanded and then reconstituted as a JFO, or Joint Forces or operation. Um, it, to say that, well, even getting sidetracked here perhaps, but you mentioned Jean Chrétien and the sponsorship scandal. Well, don't forget, before that, there was the billion-dollar boondoggle. There was the Charles Guite scandal. There was the Schwinnegate thing over the sale of Hotel Auberge Grand Mère. There was and the great granddaddy of them all for that liberal government was the former public works minister Alfonso Galeano, who was tied to the Caruana mob family. You know, it's to even think that there's not corruption in politics is naive.
But do you believe that a lot of it is under the surface? So these are the cases we know about, right? Is there a lot that we don't know about? Is this sort of the 20% that we know about, and then maybe 80% is hiding under the surface? It's never been investigated. It'll never be investigated because the people have been smart enough to cover their tracks.
Part of the problem with all of that is when you bestow a lot of power, and especially the ability to lavish money on pet projects, and you allow on the same hand the ability of lobbyists to lobby cabinet ministers to here's my pet project or a company I want to help out or all that, you're really inviting corruption. In my view, lobbyists should be outlawed and banned, just period, full stop. If I run a company and I want a meeting with a cabinet minister, I go through the cabinet minister's office, I specify what the meeting is to be about, and then the cabinet minister will either deign to give me time and listen to my argument or not. For me to hire, for $500,000, a lobbyist firm to go and lobby that cabinet minister and maybe others to see if he'll lavish a great big benefit on me, I think is just invites corruption.
A lot of the corruption, I think, is sort of legal in the sense that I'm talking about is a lot of politicians, after they're done their service in politics, will sit on corporate boards or they'll sit on the boards of various nonprofit organizations that they've been particularly kind to during their service in politics. What I'd like to ask, actually, is whether this is a problem from the point of view of foreign infiltration of Canadian politics, right? So are we when we're talking about the United States, when we're talking about China or Russia, do these countries have any particular,
Let's look at Jean Chrétien.
All right.
He was a cabinet minister under Justin's father in the 70s and early 80s. When Trudeau retired after taking his infamous walk in the snow, John Turner won the leadership competing against Jean Chrétien. Jean Chrétien, not seeing an immediate future for himself in politics, went to work in the private sector. Where did he land? He landed at Gordon Capital, owned by Li Ka-shing, probably the biggest gangster in the world. And he went in there essentially having gone in as a public servant, and he came out as a multimillionaire when he assumed control of the Liberal Party. Now, do you think there's undue influence there? Of course there is. In 1997, the RCMP and CSIS did a joint review under the name Project Sidewinder. They generated a report which recommended a full-blown investigation into organized crime in infiltration into Canadian politics. Not only organized crime, but the government of the PRC, the People's Republic of China as well, who were acting in conjunction with the Asian organized criminals, one of whom was Li Ka-shing, and he's named very specifically in that report. Instead of giving authority for the investigation to be launched, the Prime Minister's office intervened. Prime Minister at the time was Chrétien, and he killed the investigation. Just killed it. Done.
And it hasn't been reopened since then.
No.
That's crazy. That's insane. Well, on that note, thank you for being with us, Lee. Where can we find you, Leo?
You can find me at True North. I put a couple of pieces up a week, usually a video comment a week and a column or two, which is at tnc.news, or I host a website called primetimecrime.com, which is updated regularly with crime stories of interest.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us, Leo. We appreciate it. And take care.
Thanks, Cornelius.
Have a good one. Bye.